My name is Christopher Walton, and I am a mental health therapist, author, and professional speaker. The title of my book is Navigating Your Mind, Achieving a Life of Peace, Joy, and Happiness. And this is our podcast that we're doing in order to be able to help people learn how to have better relationships and connect.
Mhm. Hi, my name is Caroline Azzo, and I'm one of your co-hosts. And welcome to the Navigating Your Mind podcast, where we explore the fascinating world of mental health and all of its implications for our daily lives. Each episode will conduct interviews involving experts, interesting case studies, and have lively conversations about the effects of living in our changing world and its impact on us. We'll be your guide as we navigate this ever-evolving landscape and discover how a healthy mentality can change our relationships for the better. So join us and let's start learning. Today, we have Annie Ellen joining us. She's a licensed mental health therapist and PhD who's licensed in both Texas and Idaho. She lives in Texas with her husband, two teenagers, and their various pets. And she believes in the transformative power of authentic relationships with ourselves and with others to challenge us, help us grow, and help us expand our notion of what it means to love and be human. So thank you for joining us, Annie. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what we're going to be talking on?
Sure, thanks for having me on. Yes, I'm Annie Allen, recently Dr. Allen. Um, and so kind of what I'd like to talk about is identity. It's kind of what my dissertation was about, exploring identity and what I call a post-human world. And that really essentially is about the changing effects of who we think we are when we add in AI, when we add in social media, when we add in things like diagnosing, which is a more recent phenomenon in the mental health field. So that's kind of what I want to talk about. So the interesting thing that I've seen lately is the uptick in young adults coming to therapy with already kind of an idea of what they're struggling with in terms of a diagnosis. And they get these diagnoses usually from like TikTok or Instagram, but mostly TikTok is where we're seeing it from. And then add to that we're also, talking about possibly banning TikTok, not just for kind of the information that might be being shared with other parties, but also because there is an effect on young adults. And that's like a whole nuanced argument. But I just think it's really interesting and relevant to right now.
Agreed. I thought it was really interesting that you brought up having patients come in with their own diagnoses. What are some of like the pros and cons of that awareness that it brings?
Well, I do think that there's some validity to wanting to find a label to kind of explain what's going on with you, like kind of your internal state. I also think that ultimately people know themselves better in a lot of ways than somebody on the outside, right? I mean, that's kind of like a given of life is that we're all isolated from each other at the most basic level. As close as I can be to my husband, I will never actually know what it is to be my husband and experience the world as my husband. Um, but at the same time, going to a mental health professional can help you kind of have a more objective lens to other possible explanations for what's going on. And when people come in with a diagnosis and they're set in that, they may not always be willing to accept other possibilities, or they may be limiting their identity in a lot of ways to that diagnosis.
I think it's interesting that people are identifying themselves as a diagnosis, and that was not the intent behind the DSM-5 initially, is to come up with an identity around oneself, around the diagnosis. Initially, it was an explanation for professionals to be able to identify characteristics of a different diagnosis in order to be able to have somewhat of a shortcut in that communication, in addition to using billing codes. So it's not necessarily was built around an identity. So why do you think that phenomenon is taking place, that people are wanting to have a diagnosis to qualify or help them with their identity?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things going on right now. We're living in a very particular time where, at the most basic level, we are not quite sure what it means to be human anymore. And identity is one of those things that's shifting in a number of ways, whether it comes to sexuality, whether it comes to gender, whether it comes to like what does it mean to be a masculine person in the world. There's a lot of kind of shape shifting going on. And so a diagnosis kind of, for some people, when they adopt that as their identity, it becomes a way to communicate to other people very easily. This is who I am, and this is where I'm placing myself in the world. This is how I am in the world. And so I think that's a big part of it. And, my dissertation was on posthumanism, which is a philosophy about questioning what it means to be human. And what that means is our definition of human is from a Cartesian liberal model. So we think that the human is just automatically endowed with rationality, with logic, that the mind and the body are very separate. And that we are kind of the center of all things. Humans are the center of all things. And the interesting thing with this definition of human is we've continually had people who were less human than the center human, which is like the white, cis male, straight. From everything from that center, the further you were from it, the less kind of human you were. And so now that we have AI and we have, biotech, and we have AI even writing poems for us and things like that, I think like humans in general are experiencing a predicament of like, well, then what's our place in the world? If suddenly these things that we've always othered can do what we have said only humans can do, what does that really mean? And so there's kind of like a massive existential crisis going on.
Can you talk a little bit more about the existential crisis aspect of it?
Yeah. I guess I would ask you like more specifically with an existential crisis, what would you want to know more about it? Because I think there's like layers to it, right?
Right. I think previously, a lot of times existentialism had to do a lot with religions and different religions that people identified to that became part of a group. And it seems like a lot of people are in, quote, existential crisis, in a quote, that is putting them in a position to invent themselves or to separate themselves from traditional organized religions or religious philosophies. And so even like the advent of robotics, like with what Elon Musk is doing, and I guess these robots are going to be wandering the planet here soon. And that we'll be having relationships with them on even more so than what we're doing with AI, and AI is definitely going to be a part of that. And so there's this shift in thinking, a shift in understanding about a belief of self. And so I think the crisis of this has happened very quickly too, over probably the past 10, 15 years or so, versus the course of 10 million years or 6,000 years, depends on what your belief system is. But that's a very, very rapid change. And I think that's another one of the reasons why people are in a state of emotional desperation with wanting to find out, who am I? What is my place? What is my value? And I think identifying the value around the DSM-5 diagnosis of that they came from, not necessarily a medical professional, but the self-diagnosis, it creates a sense of value. Is that what you mean?
Yes, and I think that's a great point to bring it back to kind of like why this TikTok diagnosing is such a phenomenon. Not only does it give individuals like a way to communicate who they are, it is also giving them a sense of community. Like there are, millions of videos on ADHD, millions of videos on, even dissociative identity disorder. And so when we're thinking about, kind of like we're getting less religious, and more than just religion, we don't have a lot of community groups. And that lack of community is being created online because we are social creatures. We need community. So if we're not having it in the physical realm, then we're going to go to a different realm. And so you're seeing this kind of on, these social media platforms. This becomes that almost community experience for them, except you're missing some other more vital components, I think.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there's a danger in committing so much of your identity and your community to a diagnosis, especially one that wasn't given by a professional?
Yes, I think it can be detrimental in a lot of ways. One of the really cool things about adopting kind of a more interconnected, expansive view of what it means to be human is that you understand that a diagnosis could never be who you are. It is one part of you, right? And so you limit yourself so much whenever your identity becomes some kind of mental health diagnosis that explains everything you do and everything you're going to do. Because, what if there were different ways? What if there were different ways of being that were possible to you, but you can't see that because you've adopted this thing as your identity? What happens when you lose that? It's very scary for people.
I think it's an interesting piece too, is that people can shift out of major depressive disorder or, upon different training or whatever the case may be. And so if it's not, I guess I'm confused whether or not if people identify to a particular diagnosis, is that something that they anticipate carrying for the rest of their lives or the rest of, extended period of time, which is counterintuitive to what mental health therapy is really about, which is trying to help people overcome these complications as opposed to entrenching in the idea.
I think a great deal of some of my therapy work has been on asking some of my clients, like, how is this serving you? Because they come in with that is a marker of depression, right? Hopelessness and hopelessness
Yeah.
about your own state of being. And so helping them become more empowered and helping them understand that like identity is not static, right? Like we change all throughout the course of our life.
Sure.
Why couldn't you be happier? Why couldn't you live life more healthily? Why couldn't you be more connected? And so, yeah, I think a big part of therapy is trying to get clients to let go of identity as static.
Are there other ways as a mental health professional that you can intervene or help these people separate their diagnosis from their identity?
To be honest, sometimes I just go for psychoeducation. What is the DSM really for? Kind of going back to what Chris was saying, it was never created to give people an identity. It was created for professionals to be able to easily communicate, okay, these are where the symptoms fall under. But it was meant to be like, this is who you are now, and this is who you will always be, or this is what you're always going to struggle with. Some things there definitely will be, but it was never meant for that. More than anything, it's a billing code, right?
That's right.
So I think just explaining that, that yes, you have these symptoms, but you can still live a full life. Your symptoms are not everything about you. There are so many other components to who you are. And so we really focus on building those up.
And I think that it's another position of disconnection and loneliness. And that, like you were talking about before, there's this lack of community, that people are not getting together as much. There's still I'm not sure if it's fear factor around COVID. I think it's a leftover from COVID that people don't go out. They have a hard time asking people to get together or have a sense of friendship or community. And so people get used to doing online interactions, kind of like we're doing right now. I mean, we're doing a podcast online, as opposed to a live version of that somehow on like a webinar. We're all sitting in the same room. So this is become the new norm. And it's so people, I think, feel that and pine for levels of love and connection. And when they don't get that, I think it's about finding that sense of community through a state of fantasy. So you can't taste, touch, or smell the person around you. And so they have to make up for it. And I think it does drive and create more anger, anxiety, depression, sense of loneliness, wanting to have love or connection, but not knowing how to do it. And then having a lot of fear factor inside of oneself that promotes that. And so having the identity around a diagnosis does give people a sense of community, for people to have a place to go to and to talk about or identify with, or to be posting about, and also getting a lot of understanding or attention from other people who are going through the same thing. And I think a lot of it is really focused and based in loneliness, based on the disconnection.
And there is that component too. And I don't want to say like all the negative things that come from, self-diagnosis through TikTok, or just because there are good things too, right? It can help reduce mental health stigma. There is a component. I would rather people have online community than no community. So and again, like sometimes people come in, and I think there's been studies done where like 40% of the time they're right. There's 60% of the time they're not. But I mean, there's a pretty large portion that like they go get diagnosed by a professional, and those two things go together. But still, I always the problem with this online diagnosis part is that not only are they having to get fantasy kind of filling in the blanks because it's online, but sometimes that reinforces the mental health symptoms that are negatively impacting their lives. Like if you're getting sympathy online, if you're getting, constant affirmation, that feels good. That releases
Yeah.
dopamine. So you keep coming back for more. So it again keeps you kind of stuck there. And we don't want our clients to be stuck. We want you to, progress and, fulfill your life to whatever potential you want to fill it to.
So it does create an attachment
Yeah.
process to the community, also the attachment to the diagnosis that created the attachment to the community. That puts people in a position where they don't necessarily maybe not want to break out of that identity because that's where their friend base is, or the love base, connective base is at. So it's not always this negative thing, obviously, because like you were saying, I think a lot of people get benefit out of it, but it also has that negative aspect of it. It's a little concerning for mental health people. They're trying to promote better mental health and love and connection in real time, as opposed to just doing it online. So I think that it's a complicated situation. What do you suggest are the solutions or potential ideas to be able to help people out?
Well, one of the things that I tell, like I have clients that a lot of their life is spent online or at home. Maybe they remote work, they don't do a whole lot with other people. They don't really risk the hurt that would come from asking somebody to connect and being told no, thank you. Um, and I think that's what online provides. It's like you can just block somebody, right? You can just, move on. It's a lot easier to handle rejection online for people than it is to we share the same physical space. Now, what do I do with my body when you've told me no? So teaching clients how to tolerate that uncomfortable feeling, and teaching clients how to tolerate the awkwardness that comes with connecting with somebody for the first time, like embracing it. Like there are some people you will click with and it'll feel natural immediately, but they're some of my best friends or people I had to put time into. I had to embrace that awkwardness. And so giving clients almost social skills, again, like teaching them those types of things, I think can really be helpful for helping them kind of, because we can't just take the community from them. We have to find something healthy to replace it with. And we have to also take away the shame component, like I understand why you're doing this. I get it. But have you considered this is kind of the take that I do.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really interesting that you mentioned like the awkwardness that people feel in person. And as someone who's 20 years old, I feel like my generation is starting to come up on, children who grew up having access to an online space their entire lives. Like I didn't have access to that until I was a teenager, and I still see, peers that can't navigate these physical situations, and they had, up until they were a teenager to figure that out. Do you think it's going to have like a huge impact on these children that have access to these online communities, like as they're developing their social skills?
I definitely think that it will. And in addition to having clients who struggle with some type of social anxiety that I think is exacerbated by so much online presence, is having parents kind of navigate this with their children. Because you have parents, as a parent, I'm a parent of two teenagers. I hurt when my kid hurts. And so if I have, and my daughter, sixth grade was terrible for her. And this was also at COVID. Like we had the choice of either going back to in-person school or doing, online school. And we chose to have her back at school because, keeping your child at home while, yes, you're protecting them from the uncomfortableness that is, physical space sometimes, is also worsening that social anxiety. Like it doesn't get better in seclusion. It gets better like when you are actually having to face that over and over again and learning to tolerate that. So, so yeah, like I tell my parents that are clients that I know it hurts, but like your job as a parent is to push your kid and be there as a safeguard. But your job is not to put them in a bubble, including an online bubble.
Mhm.
You want them to interact with the world.
So if a child like approached their parent with something of a self-diagnosis that they learned from TikTok, how should a parent handle that situation?
Well, I definitely think they should ask them, approach it with curiosity. Why do you think that? What kinds of things are you struggling with? Um, not from a place of, no, you don't have that. No, don't be silly, or you need less online time. That's probably not the best approach. But, approaching from a place of compassion, trying to understand, and then saying, okay, well, let's make an appointment with a mental health therapist, or a mental health professional that can help us get this sorted out. Because if your kid is coming to you with that, that means they want help. That means they want some guidance. That's what you're there for.
I think a lot of times kids and adults have a hard time identifying how they feel. And so they're having internal pressures inside their stomach, chest, throat, back, neck, something like that. And it's hard to know what that means because there's oftentimes not a lot of emotional intelligence that is taught, obviously in school. They don't necessarily focus on that, which is emotional awareness and emotional communication. And what I see is a lot of times kids don't feel like their parents understand that language. And so they can take that language online or to their peers in school, especially when I see them in junior high, high school for sure. So there's a disconnect of their parents because a lot of times there's a mistrust where the parents are not going to get it. And their parents are not really aware of everything that's happening on social media in general. And so that disconnect puts them in a position of more isolation. And so they're getting feedback from their peer group, which is perpetuating the idea. And so a lot of times parents are really unaware about the depths of the suffering or loneliness or pain from the child's perspective. The child really wants and pines to have that closeness to the parent, but a lot of times parents are rather disconnected, busy. They may be clueless to a certain degree. They may frost it over like it's not really that big of a deal. Yeah, I think another piece of that is I was at dinner with my wife the other day, and we saw a family, and there was three kids. Each of them had an iPad, like a full-size iPad, and the iPads were communicating. The parents sat there silent. My wife and I was talking about it. My wife is a school teacher, and we were somewhat surprised that at dinner, three young children are being entertained with an iPad, and no one else is speaking or talking. And again, so social media is raising our children, and I don't know if they have full access to the internet or whatever was happening. We didn't observe that much, but the point about it is that a lot of times parents are turning over parenting to social media or to the internet in some way to keep them entertained or whatever, and that becomes their identifying partner or identifying parent to a certain degree. You have any thoughts about that?
I mean, I think there are a lot of thoughts about that. I so when we talk about the larger, more systemic forces, I think here at play is there are we need more community and we need more connection, not just at the community level, the more macro or meso level, but also at that individual home level. The problem with that is that sometimes we do not have the infrastructure to really support that. So it's one thing to like want that for people and know that it's the healthy thing. In fact, I think most of our families know it's the healthy thing. But if there is not the infrastructure to support it, so if you have, like you said, mom and dad are touched out, they're both working, full-time jobs, you've got the kids' activity, all these things that where is the leisure time really? And, we're lucky mental health, or I am, to be able to kind of set my own hours. But for the vast majority of Americans, that is not the case, right? They're set for you. And so I think it's also that understanding that now that the government is trying to get involved in even monitoring or banning, a TikTok, we should also be having a conversation of, okay, but why are so many people congregating here? And how can we make it to where people want to and have the support necessary to congregate with each other in real life?
Mhm. I would love to hear both of your opinions on the Utah ban on technology for all minors that they just passed. I don't know if you're how familiar you are, but
I'm aware about that. So
yeah,
what I think what you're talking about is Utah legislature, and I think the governor just signed off on it, was you have to have parents' permission to be participating in social media at any time prior to the age of 18.
yeah,
So
and
there has to be a parental consent for it.
they're also putting a curfew on for every child under 18. So
Oh, I
I
didn't hear
say
that
it's
part.
like 10:30 p.m. until 6:30 in the morning. They don't know how they're going to do it, in reality, but it'll be no technology access for anyone under 18 for those hours.
And what's the fine? Who's going to implement it? Is that going to come down on the parents? What does that mean? I don't understand what that means.
Mhm.
And again, yeah, thank you for bringing that. I did not know that. I think that it is a growing concern. And again, it's one of those things where, like, yes, I'm concerned with people finding so much community online and it not being equal in the real world. It would be one thing if you have an online community and you have a real life community and they're balanced, right? But at the same time, I know that it would probably not be helpful to just take away the one community they have and then, just there's nothing else to replace it with. So it's this kind of like passing this legislation without really, I think, thinking about, okay, but why? What are things we're going to replace this activity with? Are we giving families enough support to be able to spend time together? And so it's things like that. But I'm going to be interested to follow that and see what the effects are. That would be really, really cool to see.
I think it also speaks about the desperation that they're finding there in order for the legislature to come up with that idea, and that there was enough support from their jurisdictions to be able to pass such a law. I find that to be very intriguing. So because there's again, I think that a lot of parents and older people are wanting to help kids to find a place of love and support and community that is not in an artificial space. But even as adults, and we've talked about this in our practice here, is that as adults, we too find ourselves online or on a video or on Netflix or whatever the case may be, as opposed to being askers and getting to know other people and taking the risk of asking other people. Because I think there's somewhat of a mental block within inside of ourselves. I think this is more post-COVID, is my thinking, and that is it's hard to ask and it's hard to take the risk to be able to step outside of oneself to be able to go do that. And people used to be outside more frequently, and now I think there's people that it's just less often that people are getting out, and so it's hard to go knock on someone's door, to call someone up and say, hey, do you want to go to lunch or something like that.
Yeah.
I think there's been a change over the past several years, and I think this is somewhat of the outcome of COVID and how we've become so isolated.
Yeah. And I want to say, even kind of before that, I mean, you think about the prevalence of things like, I hate small talk. Well, small talk is how we first gain connection, right? Like you're going to have to, you don't just go to somebody and be like, tell me your deepest secret, like that's not how conversations are going to
Yeah.
start. And so I think there's also this hesitation if we know that so many people hate small talk, supposedly it's become a running joke, that if I come and I ask them how their day is and I'm really curious about it, that I'm going to get a brush off and then I'm going to feel like, oh my gosh, I bothered this person. And so there is that component as well that I think stops people from wanting to just do casual connections that it takes to finally get to deeper connections.
And that takes risk.
Mhm.
And a lot of times people are rather risk avoidant. because it's easier to do what I know how to do as opposed to taking the risk to do something I don't know how to do. But internally, inside of all of us, is we're pining for love, and we're pining for connection, we're pining for closeness, we're pining for friendships, or for fun, or whatever. We're looking for these levels of attachment in real time. Because a lot of times, I've worked with many clients, young and old, who are having long distance relationships. So I was talking to a person recently who lives out of state in Nevada, and she has a relationship with a man in Canada, and they've been dating for the past 6 months, never have met, they're measuring the relationship based on what they see and what they hear. So it's 2/5 of our capacity. So the other bigger part of closeness and attachment is measuring taste, touch, and smell, and being able to observe people in real time and pick up on the audio nuances of who they are, where they're at, as opposed to, and also the situation, maybe the birds singing outside or whatever. There's other aspects of that create a wholeness around the levels of closeness and attachment that create a sense of fulfillment within inside of self. And if we're only measuring this based on the audio visual aspect of social media, then we have to make up for what we don't pick up with the other 3 senses or 5 senses that we're not aware of. We're not able to pick that up. And I think this is one of the things that really promotes a lot of this feelings of loneliness and the existential crisis we're talking about, and the other aspects of levels of disconnection.
Who am I? Why am I here? Finding meaning from life.
Yeah.
And I guess that is also a thing to consider, is that maybe these diagnoses like serve as meaning for some people.
Right.
Like my meaning is to spread awareness of this and to be somebody who embodies this, and this is what living with this is like. I could see how that drives purpose, And so it's about channeling, okay, well, what else can we do with that? Because I think identity is multifaceted, and I think purpose can be multifaceted.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the purpose of, let me just throw this in real quick. I see the purpose is really trying to maybe bring awareness to the situation and take that awareness of the people who may be suffering like me. That is creating somewhat of a connection there, but it's also maybe that act of love that you're offering to other people in order for them to not have to suffer like you were saying. So, but I'm not sure if it's necessarily making up for the other aspects of the disconnection.
Yeah. And I agree with you on that. I'm trying to really like drill down into the reasons why people are finding these communities, and they are very strong communities. And so we have to understand it to start to be able to be like, okay, these are some interventions we might want to offer up, especially now that, again, government is getting involved. I think this is something that mental health professionals may be wanting to start having a say in, because we're the ones seeing the effects of it.
Mm-hmm. I think that it was really important too, Christopher, you brought up a few minutes ago, how the online only allows you to see what people want you to see. And I think that really connects back to the TikTok diagnosis too, because people only show the parts of their mental illness that they want people to see. And I think that's what people latch on to. Like, I think like bipolar disorder is a great example where people will post online about their manic episodes. And like, I think people want that, and they want to connect to that, and they want to relate to that, but they don't highlight the depressive episodes that come with those. And like, they don't show that part to everyone online.
Yeah, that is such a good point. I mean, it really is. I don't know if y'all watch reality TV. I'm a reality TV junkie, but I watch a lot of 90 Day Fiance. I think we talked about this actually in group. But
Yeah.
I love that show because it's all about that, and then you see them either go to their countries, or the people from those countries come to the US, and how different it is once they are in the same space together. And so because you have been lacking those other forms of attachment for so long, you don't fully know this person, even in the way that I could know like my husband, right? Because we live in the same space. So that show is really cool to see actually the effects play out for national audiences.
Mm-hmm.
There's this confusion that, because I think a lot of times young people are not necessarily aware of different options because they have been raised online and they have been raised in that feed. What do you suggest on how to be able to offer a help for parents, or help for even a lot of kids, because they're feeling these things that we're talking about inherently. They're feeling it intrinsically. They're feeling it, and so how to be able to help them break through the wall of making a goal or an idea, or come up with some type of a concept, maybe to reach out to a therapist, or maybe reach out to someone by how do we help people break through the wall? Do you know what I'm talking about? The wall that we have.
The wall that we have with,
It's usually internal. It's an internal wall that stops us from taking risks to try new things.
yeah, that is a great question. And I think it depends, on each person. I know like what your kid typically responds to. There's a why does the wall exist in the first place, right? This fear of stepping out from the unknown, like from risking anything comes from this idea that like our brain cannot distinguish between physical threat and emotional threat. And so understanding that your body may be reacting this way, but it isn't necessarily like if you were being chased by a tiger, right? So we tend to overestimate the pain of any kind of rejection or things going wrong, and we tend to underestimate our ability to tolerate it. So I think it's building up that in a kid, saying like, look, I don't know how it's going to turn out. We don't know how life is going to turn out 90% of the time. I could leave I don't say this to your kid, but honestly, like I could leave my house today and get in a wreck, like I cannot control for everything. However, I do not want that lack of control to control my life, to live my life in such a small box that doesn't really seem like living to me.
Yeah, and I think a couple other ideas is the law of averages. I was talking about this in staff meeting the other day. The law of averages, every time we try something new, is 2/3 of the time we're going to fail, but 1/3 of the time we're going to succeed. And of that 1/3 of the time we succeed, we can choose which one of those options that is going to best fit us. But that takes risk. And for a lot of times, most people are risk avoidant because they don't want to deal with the possibility of being rejected, being abandoned, being wrong, being inadequate. That creates a sense of shame that I am not good enough, because most people, especially young people, feel massive amounts of inadequacy and worthlessness based on the measurements of self to social media. One thing I've challenged my young adult and adolescent clients is to take a 30-day sabbatical off TikTok, just because they're constantly measuring their body value, the value of their soul or value of their body. So I see mostly adolescent females or young adult females, because they're the ones who show up in therapy. But the thing is, there's this valuelessness based on I don't measure up to the outside world expectation that creates this internal chatterbox of negative thinking that I'm inadequate. And so the outcomes of that is what I've seen is that people who take a 30-day sabbatical, the 30 days turns into 6 months, and it's kind of turned into longer than that with some people. And so they periodically would get on, or they're turning it off, getting it on, turning it off, because they're finding that their levels of happiness and joy and opportunity is actually higher, because they're not necessarily looking in this negative mirror about inadequacy so frequently. Is that a fair thought? So it's really about how to shift the idea by taking a sabbatical, or taking time out is what that means. Sabbatical, taking time out, time off from that constant reminder of inadequacy, to be able to try on new ideas, to take these risks.
And I think I think that's great, and that's something I also recommend. And I did use the 2/3, the law of
law of averages, yeah,
law of averages with a client the other day. Actually, it was very helpful. I think that when we're talking about risk, right now we're talking about the risk on the children's side. Like, how do we step out? How do we, encounter like what it would be like to be without social media for 30 days? But with parents, it's also, kind of processing, yeah, it's probably going to be uncomfortable to see your child have a meltdown, maybe. Maybe it's going to be a little uncomfortable to see them cry and maybe act like their life is going to end if they don't, have these tools at their disposal, tools or what outlets at their disposal. But, taking that risk that this is ultimately going to probably be better for them in the long run. And on a personal note, our daughter went to church camp last week, and she was devastated she wasn't going to have her phone. Like they don't allow phones at camp. And I had to sit with that and be like, look, you're going, you were going to be fine, but like seeing her have a meltdown, well, it wasn't a meltdown, but she was just crying, it was a little like heartbreaking, but I'm like, it's going to be better for you. What happened? She went, she had a great time. She made good friends. She's going to go back over the summer. And so it was taking that risk that, like, I'm not a terrible parent. She's going to be fine. And just, it was better for her. Right.
It's hard to convince kids, and I think it's like the Utah law. Just taking away the device and not having a replacement is terrifying for people, because essentially you're ripping away their attachment to their friends, their attachment to, all the things that they get the dopamine hit from. And so we got to be careful about not just ripping it away, because and going through that process, we got to figure out how to have buy-in from the kid, young adult, in order to be able to see how it's detrimental. And so talking to them about, what is the effect? We have cause and effect relationships by doing that, and by walking down a logical process. I think a lot of times people will just say, okay, I'm willing to try this for 8 hours, or try this, for a day, and see how I feel. So we're measuring feelings. And so it's increasing awareness around emotional expression, emotional understanding, and having emotional vocabulary. So if a person's having feelings inside of their stomach, chest, and throat, we need to identify those feelings and then maybe write that out, put it out on a piece of paper. And then also, I think what works really well is replacement language. For example, is that the idea of something like, I don't like it, that's okay, I can stand it anyway. I can do this. I can do this. And the replacement language ideas, we're saying that to ourselves 50 times first thing in the morning, midday, and before we go to bed. Or anytime we're in that stressful situation, if we're continuing to constantly engaging in logical process that we can do something, and we're engaging our frontal lobes as opposed to our lizard brain in the back, where I can't stand anything. I always have to be fed what I feel. And if people get caught up in that loop, it just creates anger, anxiety, depression, misery, and honest, disconnection. But how to engage in logical thinking puts people in a position where they are able to stand it and able to find success. And that creates an additional motivation. So this is teaching people a basic cognitive behavioral approach that helps people in order to have a basic understanding of a psychological theory in order to be able to create a different outcome. And that creates motivation. It creates a sense of I have a little bit of grit to do something that's hard. As opposed to the lizard brain is, I always have to feel good. I always have to feel good. So I want to go to the places where I feel good. I feel good with my online friends. I feel good with my device. I feel good with whatever this thing is that I'm addicted to the process of, as opposed to setting it down and knowing that I'm okay inside of self. When we learn how to be okay inside of self, we become more empowered. But if we're subjected to the outside influences in order to be liked or loved, in order to feel okay, the lizard brain idea is that we never are okay. We're always anxious and fearful of inadequacy and worthlessness, helplessness, hopelessness. And so we never really get to a place of being okay and present. Because I think most people know the most happy place is really now. But most people live in the past or in the future. Again, it perpetuates the idea of getting back online to get soothed of the suffering of that loneliness by those addictive behaviors, because that's the place where we find a sense of okayness, even though it's lonely.
And I think that's what I mean too, whenever I tell clients, like, yeah, you're going to be a little uncomfortable if you do this for the first time. That's okay. Like life is not, unfortunately, just about pleasure and feeling good. There's a whole gamut of emotions out there. It would
Right.
not really be living if these were the only three emotions you ever had, right? So it's about not avoiding those emotions, embracing them as a part of life. And the more you understand, you can embrace awkwardness, you can embrace, being uncomfortable or being stressed or this person not liking you, the more empowered you do feel, the more confident you feel just being. And it's teaching clients that, like, yeah, that is going to happen. And on that note, when we talk about parents interacting with their kids, letting kids see you when, and letting them know your own stories of failure, your own stories of rejection, that you see me now, I seem pretty okay, and I've had these experiences, and that's a part of it. So I think that that is also a really good point you just made, Chris, about how do we get people to be more confident with themselves, just being in the moment. And a part of that would mean, embracing just suffering and being uncomfortable sometimes, but that you can also, you're strong enough, you can do that.
Mhm.
But that it does. We do have to have a replacement language inside of our mind because we have parts of ourselves. This idea of part therapy, PhD, PARP therapy, and that is these different parts of ourselves. And so that's part of that lizard brain idea that these things are arguing inside of ourselves. Well, I should do this. Well, maybe I shouldn't do that, but I feel like I want to do this. And as long as those things are kind of bouncing around and competing inside of ourselves, is we get stuck in the cycle of I'm tired of this. I need to escape from feeling this level of misery. So by using those replacement language ideas, I choose to only allow myself to think this one thought. And that is, I cannot be liked and loved by everyone all the time, and I'm okay. I'm going to try this new thing, and I'm okay if I fail. I'm going to do this thing. So we pick one of these things we say to ourselves 50 times, first thing in the morning, midday, and before we go to bed, anytime before, during, or after that interaction is that we at first we feel like we're lying to ourselves for the first 10 or 15 times we say it. But after that, we start to moderate that thought. And then we start to believe it for the time brain neuroplasticity. We're forcing those neurons inside of our mind, inside of our, not our mind, but inside of our brain to be able to rewire in new circuits in order to be able to come up with new thoughts that we can do, as opposed to emotional thoughts that we cannot do. So we're addicted to the old wiring based on how we were indoctrinated from our environments and also from maybe from our depression or anxiety that we're having at that time. These are real things. They're not fake things, they're real things. And so how to be able to rewire that is to force ourselves to do it on a daily basis over the course of about 21 weeks. Because it takes not 21 weeks, 21 days in order to create a habit. It takes 3 weeks to develop a habit. The more we practice, even though we feel like we're lying to ourselves, but the more we practice that, is it becomes our new reality. As opposed to the rhetoric, which is the screaming of all of these different voices from all over the world, all over TikTok or whatever the case may be. The voices are always telling us we're worthless, we're inadequate, or we can't do it, we're not pretty, we're not handsome, we're not smart, we're not whatever, we can't measure up to. And how to turn down the noise of that and to have buy-in to turning down the noise and try psychological techniques that have been proven to be effective over the past 100 years all over the world in all aspects of humanness. And as we practice these things, as we can find a greater sense of peace, joy, and happiness, as opposed to anger, anxiety, and depression. And so that is perpetuating what works as opposed to buying into what is popular. So we were talking the other day about pop psychology. Can you talk about that, Annie? What does that mean?
Well, essentially, it's like little tiny tidbits of information on much more complex subjects. And so they almost provide simple answers to, really complex problems. And there's not a lot of real information there. And obviously, like reality, there are constraints to it, right? You've got like 30 seconds to explain something, or this is a meme. There's only so many like words you can put on it. And so, but that proliferates. And when people are online, they're like, well, what's the use of going to see a professional? You know, I get all this stuff online, right? I have all the answers. And it's like, well, no, that's not really what it is, because the other part with therapy is learning how to have an authentic relationship with another person, being accepted and not at all judged, and understanding then that I can take this experience with me out into the real world. And so that's something that you're not going to get from these online little tidbits of information that you find.
How do you apply these ideas inside of your mind? Because we're coming up on the end of the hour here. I'm wondering how do you apply this to the people that you see, and how can you help them out?
I think when I began a relationship with a client, I talked to them about therapy as really a process of relationship. We, in the beginning, this is us getting to know each other and building rapport. And then once I have a more full idea of what it's like to be you and live your life, then we come up together. It's very collaborative, right? Like, what are the things that have created who you are? Who is it? What kinds of changes do you want for yourself? What kinds of changes do you want to see in your life? And then we collaborate on ways to start addressing those fears and anxieties and shame that are keeping you stuck. And so that's kind of, I tell them that, because sometimes I'll have clients that are like, um, they come in with already a plethora of information from online. And so my job as a therapist is not only to build up our relationship, and that's a very unique thing that you will not find online, is to also do some, psychoeducation, some cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, some, acceptance and commitment therapy techniques, whatever techniques that really that client will respond to that fits with them. We will use that then to not just develop a relationship, but also change their life.
And so you're asking them to practice those techniques in real time,
right?
And not just online,
right? And not, definitely understanding that, okay, it may be uncomfortable and you're still going to be okay, right? That replacement language. Yes, it might be a little awkward to ask your friend at work that you've been eyeing out for coffee, and you can still do it and you will be okay. So yes, I mean, it doesn't just stay in this space. That's not my job. My job is to help you live your real life healthier and happier and more peacefully.
In your real life.
Yeah. In real life. Yeah. Real life. Yeah. In real life.
Yeah. So it's an interesting time, like you were talking about in the very beginning, is that we are living this interesting time where people are living in somewhat of an artificial life, and we're trying to help them to have more of an authentic life. And I think that's something we talk a lot about in therapy and all over social media. I want to be authentic. What does that mean? I want to be connected. That's what that means to me. I want to be connected. I want to find love. I want to find closeness. I want to find friendship. And so our job is to teach people how to be able to do that in real time.
Yeah. Yeah. I also want to say on the authentic piece, in addition to those things, I think a part of it is I want to be comfortable with who I am in any present moment.
Yes.
Be able to show people that person. I think that is the other component to authenticity.
Right. And having the courage to be able to do that. And sometimes it takes therapy in order to break down the walls I was talking about before, in order to be more authentic, and giving oneself permission to be authentic. We could talk about that for another hour.
I know.
Authentic. So, but I think a big piece of this is the stepping stone, the stones that we need to stumble over in order to be able to get to the next phase of our life, or the phase to be able to be authentic. Mm-hmm. And that takes usually a lifetime, by the way. You're not going to be authentic automatically at 20, because there's a lot of fears at 20.
Yeah.
Something I learned a long time ago is that 20-year-old people think everybody's thinking about them. 40-year-old people don't have time. And 60-year-old people like me realize no one was really had time to be thinking about me at all. So their time was made up with thinking about themselves.
Yeah,
so, but that's hard to convince people who are always looking online that they don't really feel like they measure up.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. So we'll talk about these things some more.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Annie. All of your insight was really amazing and it was really great to hear. And thank you for joining us on the Navigating Your Mind podcast. If you want to learn more information or set up an appointment with any of our therapists, please visit our website at eastidahotherapy.com. Annie, do you have any last remarks?
No, just thank you so much for having me on. It was really fun to talk about this, and I hope some of our listeners find this helpful.
Awesome. Well, enjoy the rest of your day, and we wish you a life of peace, joy, and happiness.